Back in the day, there were 3 television stations: NBC, ABC, and CBS. And now there's 400 television stations. What's changed, right? It's production costs went down, distribution costs went down. It got much easier to be able to create and broadcast that content. The same thing is happening in sports. And so, right, there's the big 4. My bold prediction is in 10 years, it's going to be the medium 10.
Welcome back to the Fitt Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Benary. Today I'm joined by Paris Wallace, founder and president of the National Cycling League. In this episode, we discuss the NCL's plan to revolutionize cycling in the US. Paris shares the league's approach to technology, diversity, community, and new age fandom. Plus, he explains how the NCL will engage amateur and recreational cyclists in the metaverse. Let's get into it. The Fitt Insider Podcast is brought to you by Jack Taylor, our exclusive PR partner. More than just PR, they're creative storytellers and brand builders who actually understand the health and wellness industry. To learn more, head to fit.co/JackTaylor. That's fitt.co/JackTaylor. Hi, Paris. Welcome to Fitt Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, likewise. I think there's a lot of overlaps both with sports, recreation, entertainment, technology, a lot to get into about the National Cycling League. But for folks who aren't familiar, why don't you maybe introduce yourself and tell us about the league?
Yeah, Paris Wallace. I'm the founder and chairman of the league. We got things started a little bit under 2 years ago, really to think about building a new league from scratch in the U.S., taking everything we know about sports now, what we believe about the future, and tethering that to the second most popular participatory sport in the world, cycling. 2 billion cyclists around the world, 50 million in the U.S., and one of the world's most popular professional spectator sports. The Tour de France numbers just came out, 3.5 billion viewers. So massive market, not much traction here in the US for a variety of reasons. We're really trying to fix that and make this, really a big thing here in the US and eventually globally.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I, for a little bit of time, spent my efforts focused on amateur triathlon, half Ironman, cycling, a whole bunch of different races. And it was always the number of people who grow up riding a bike, right, and learning that and doing it recreationally versus the number of people who ever do it, not only in like a competitive setting, but even like a recreational mass participation, like sports setting. There's a huge kind of disconnect. So when you mention it, the numbers, 50 million people, and you have the Tour de France, and you have something like Strava, right, who is basically like built on the back of like cyclists and endurance athletes. But then really looking across the landscape and like who's kind of building in this space, who's taking advantage of it. Maybe obvious as we're saying this now in hindsight, but how did you kind of zero in on this space and say like, hey, I think we can build this league and really do something special and unique?
Yeah, I'm a lifelong cyclist, and we talked at the top about health and wellness. I think it's one of the greatest sports in the world. You can do it forever. You can do it with people who are better than you, people that aren't quite as fit as you are. It's necessarily a gender equal sport, which is really incredible, and incredibly popular and has huge health benefits. A lot of sports, there are participants and there are fans. Cycling is one of the few sports that has a lot of participants and a lot of fans professionally. Again, most of those global fans, there is a Venn diagram, but necessarily being a cyclist doesn't mean you're a fan, and being a fan of cycling doesn't necessarily mean you're a cyclist. We're trying to change that a bit. You look at the popularity of things like Peloton, Strava, Zwift, all billion-dollar tech unicorns. There's a real ability to engage people in a deeper level, both across fandom and participation. Folks that are cycling in their home or on the road, or on the mountain, to really turn these folks into fans. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of things about the current type of cycling racing that turns people off. I actually had a conversation with someone who's an avid cycler earlier, and she was talking about getting into it and buying the expensive bike and getting the spandex kit, and said, "Hey, I'm going to watch a race." And she got 3 hours into this race, and said, "Yeah, this is not for me. I don't have 5 hours to hopefully have a sprint finish at the end." And I think a lot of it is the racing format has been around since 1860. It hasn't really been innovated a lot since then, despite all the technological advances and, obviously appetites for fans radically changing. So we're really trying to take advantage of that, both on the structure of the sport, but also on the monetization model and the way that we're creating the business to take advantage of where we think fandom's going and where we think, the business of sports is going.
Yeah, it's interesting timing. I agree with all those kind of observations, right? That I remember the first time I showed up to a race and not knowing any better. Like I was basically the only person not head to toe in spandex and like totally decked out, and I felt way out of place with like essentially my hand me down bike. So it was yeah, I could see how a lot of people otherwise would be turned off by that. I kind of took that and was like, oh, I'll get on board with all these kind of unique aspects of the sport, I guess you could say. But when you think about the way that people interact with sports, how younger generations think about being a fan of a sport, using technology to engage, thinking about that while you're also saying, like, hey, this is how we build them into this league in a kind of authentic way where it feels like second nature and you're almost catering to them. Like, how do you make that leap and say, like, maybe this is what fandom looks like and what fandom looks like for a new league that didn't exist before.
Yeah, that's a great question and something that we spent a lot of time about. And I think it's really about having a clear, hopefully right, but clear opinion on what the future of fandom looks like. And we talk a lot about 4 points. One, getting the values right, which there's a big opportunity. Unfortunately, it seems like weekly there's things in sports being done poorly. Most recently, it was the incident, the Women's World Cup victory celebration. But from day one, getting the values right, and for us, that's diverse ownership, being majority, minority, and female owned, having gender equity baked into the rules from day one, and valuing and paying women equally. And then the last one there is around sustainability. I think secondly, getting structure right. Sports need to be faster, shorter, more action packed. And the business model cannot be linear broadcast. If you are betting that people's attention spans are going to stay the way they are now, that is a losing proposition. Third, we talk about technology. Sports need to be developed right at the intersection of the metaverse and the real world. Most popular sport in the world, gaming, right? And so, how do you combine those real world sports with gaming? And I think cycling's done great. Look at Swift, look at Peloton. There's a real ability to do that, and we're trying to do similar things in the professional space. And then I would say, lastly, is about community. And I always pick on pickleball, but no one saw pickleball and was like, "Oh, we got to broadcast this. This is fire." Right? They said, "Hey, there's a massive community of people who play this, and they want to be fans of sports. They want to be fans of sports and activities that they do, right? That they participate in." And so you see that with the rise of pickleball, lacrosse, slam ball, table tennis, and cycling being the second most popular participatory sport in the world. There is a massive opportunity there if you can get those things right and then execute it in a way that people can be proud to be fans of the league and of the sport.
Yeah, I want to come back, maybe touch on some of those four pillars. But you mentioned there pickleball and lacrosse and these other sports that are emerging in terms of leagues. You have, obviously kind of famous and wealthy celebrities, athletes getting involved. We started to see that a little bit with the NCL as well, like athlete investors and so on. But when you think about all of these different emerging sports and how they're kind of in and of themselves turning into, I don't want to say empires, maybe it's a little early for some of them yet, but certainly trending in that direction relative to the opportunity and not being almost held to the same years long, decades long evolution of something like the NBA, the NFL, so on. Like, is there something, or maybe what happened that there was this moment in time of like, hey, these kind of smaller sports can turn into massive businesses, and this is how we plot that course forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different threads to pull on here, right? I mean, one, what is the size of the sport, and how do you define what the size of the sport is. Is it how many people watch it or how many people play it? Right. In terms of what do the big four have in common? 100 years and $100 billion in marketing. Right. So how do you go up against it? Well, my background is not in sports. It's in healthcare and healthcare entrepreneurship. I've built and sold to two companies in the space. And what you do in entrepreneurship generally is you go to a big established industry, right? AKA the big four. You figure out who they're not serving, what they can't do based on their model, and you beat them at it. Right. And I think that a lot of people are figuring this out at the same time, that there are these pockets of folks that, for a variety of reasons, because they don't like the values, the structure, the technology, the community, are able to build those things in other spaces. The other thing that I always tell people, right, is back in the day there were three television stations: NBC, ABC, and CBS. And now there's 400 television stations. What's changed, right? It's production costs went down, distribution costs went down. It got much easier to be able to create and broadcast that content. The same thing is happening in sports. And so, right, there's the big four. And my bold prediction is in 10 years, it's going to be the medium 10, right? Football, basketball, baseball, hockey, right? Those are always going to be there. But you're also going to have pickleball and cycling and slam ball and lacrosse and a variety of other things. And people are going to be attracted to those because they played them, because they have friends who participate in them, because it fits with, their ritual, the tens of millions of people that go for their long morning rides on Saturdays, and then they go home, and while they're drinking coffee and beer with their friends, they're going to turn on the NCL match, and it's just going to become part of their lifestyle. And that's the thing that I think is really interesting. You don't have to pick one sport or pick one team that you follow anymore just because you live in that region or just because your family followed it. You can really make more decisions, and I expect that that's going to continue to proliferate. The downside of that is how many is too many. So I think a lot of these sports that have really small audiences and are going to need to grow into their valuations, as they say in the venture world, it's going to be really hard. If you only have a couple million people in the world who have ever heard of your sport, it's going to be hard to continue to grow. And that's why we're so excited about cycling, right? With 2 billion cyclists around the world and 3.5 billion people watching the Tour de France, we can grow into that forever.
It's really cool to think about. You see this a little bit with let's say a Strava or a Zwift. Like, hey, I can now map my performance against one of these pro cyclists, or I can see their health metrics on whatever device they're tracking it on, and maybe I can see it on the screen or in the app. When you think about there's obviously the kind of current pool of pro cyclists that you're attracting to the league and signing the teams, and they're going to participate. What level of that is like, hey, these people who follow it, or younger generations who are young enough now, they'll come up where it exists, are going to be the next generation of racers and athletes and stars? Or is it more so attracting people who are already currently kind of cyclists and racers who maybe don't have the outlet that other professional sports have? What does that look like in terms of who is going to be these athletes, and the likelihood maybe that like the average cyclist that we know in our community cycling club is like participating in the NCL?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things to unpack there, and I want to get deep into the metaverse. And right now, there's 10 million people across Peloton, RGT, other platforms riding their bike in the metaverse every day. And these people are paying $40 a month for the pleasure of doing that, right? And so we want to bring a cannot miss live action pro sport to those folks, so that in addition to doing their fitness classes and the other awesome content that's offered on this content, they can actually participate live in NCL races. And so, not to get too meta, pun intended, on this, you have the race going on in person, and then you have the virtual race going on, tens of thousands of people across the globe. And yeah, if you win that virtual race and you're also winning, our in-person race that's going on at the same time, we want to talk to you. We want you to get involved in what we're doing. And I think that's a big piece. I think on the other side, right, and we've seen this with some of the other sports that have come up recently, is you have to see a career to be able to invest in something. So there's not kind of a definitive number on this, but my guess is there's 50 to 100 people that are getting paid to ride their bikes in the US, right? Americans getting paid to ride their bikes. You look at how many Americans there are on the world tour, and it's just a handful. There's a few professional teams, 32 of them were NCL athletes this year. And so, opening up those opportunities is going to have those folks who have the ability, but don't have the resources to be able to do it to say, you know what, I'm going to quit my job and focus on this full time. I'm going to take the leap. I'm going to take this seriously. I'm going to try riding in college versus track and field. Or the track and field stars are going to say, hey, I'm going to try biking because I can actually get paid to be a professional athlete. In the PLL, they give a great stat, which is before they started paying folks and it was part time, they were 80% of folks had another job and 20% were full time players. After that, it switched from 20 to 80%. And that was a statistic that always just really, really motivated and got me excited to be able to say, look, if we can actually create a sustainable business, there will be hundreds of people who want to become professional cyclists. That will elevate the US and the riders in the US. That means that all the best cyclists in the world will want to start coming here to compete in our style and our format, which is very different than the European style of racing and the traditional style of racing, and you create that flywheel. So that's really what we're trying to do, and hope that where we can eventually get.
Yeah, let's just go right down that path where you talk about the style, the format is very different. What does that look like now relative to what people think of typically like this stage, multi-day, like long events, as you mentioned, that don't necessarily hold your attention, or at least not maybe a younger demographic. What does that format look like, and then how does that unfold in terms of going to different cities, the teams competing? At this point, maybe now and going forward as well.
Yeah, and let's break that into two things, right? There's the fan side and then there's the business side. And so essentially, there are no stage races left in the United States. Why are there no stage races left in the United States? Because they are incredibly, incredibly expensive to put on. The Tour de France makes its money by charging the municipalities that it goes through to route through them. Here in the US, you have to pay for every municipality that you went through, right? It's like, and we've certainly encountered that. So, a big piece of what we're doing is short course circuit racing, which means about a mile long course in iconic locations. Our first race in Miami Beach, we shut down the beach. It was right on Ocean Drive between 8th and 13th. 20,000 people showed up. It was the biggest bike race in the US for the past 10 years. Our final race was in Atlanta. It was a Porsche Experience track. The building is actually the Avengers headquarters. It was incredible. The course was amazing, and people could show up. They could watch. Having it just be that mile means you're seeing the riders, every couple minutes. And what we've done that no one's really done before is every lap counts. And so, as opposed to having a 5 hour race with hopefully one sprint finish at the end, we have a sprint finish every couple minutes, and it is exciting. So, in Atlanta, and we switch off what gender starts first, but in Atlanta, the women rode first. They had 32 laps, boom, boom, boom. So within an hour, they had 32 sprint finishes, big points at the end. There's a scoreboard, so you actually know what's going on. The women leave the course, the men line up, the scoreboard doesn't change. So it's the men's score plus the women's score. The men had 32 laps. It came down to the final sprint. It was absolutely epic. The whole thing was done in 2 hours because ain't no one got time for that. Then, we cut it into a 1 minute TikTok with 1 minute per sprint finish, bop, 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 bop to get the action. And the winner was ultimately the women's points plus the men's points combined that makes up the team's points, and then the team score over the course of the season that ultimately decides the team that wins. So that format really works. We can do it at Porsche Experience Center. We can do it in Denver. We were at the MLS stadium there. We took over Miami Beach to do it there. And in Miami Beach, we hired Clemson University to do an impact study, and it showed that we generated $20 million in economic impact for Miami Beach. So Miami Beach is very excited to have us back again and to make this an annual thing. And so by shortening the course, by making it more exciting, not only do we get more people who are excited to come and it's a lot more accessible, but also you create a financial model that's sustainable. And we've had outreach already from dozens of cities across the world that want to have NCL racing Because again, with 3.5 billion people watching the tour, there's millions of bike racers in every city, but most cities don't have the infrastructure to support, nor the police to shut down 100 miles of road. But every city has 6 blocks that they are proud to turn in to show on the world stage, to show that they are, an incredible city and they have incredible cyclists.
Hey everyone, we'll get you back to the show in just a second. But first, I wanted to tell you about our exclusive PR partner, Jack Taylor. Honestly, this one's a no brainer. We've known the Jack Taylor team for years. They work with some of the most innovative health and wellness companies. We're talking Whoop, Athletic Greens, Hyperice, and many more. Jack Taylor has an extensive industry network, knows how to work with high growth companies, and really invests in building long term relationships. I know this firsthand because they're Fit Insider's PR agency, so I can confidently recommend them, and I do all the time. From startups to more established brands, they go beyond pushing product to help companies truly thrive. To learn more, head to fit.co/Jack Taylor. That's FITT.co/Jack Taylor. Now back to the show. Yeah, you mentioned a couple things now, and I'm piecing it together as we go in terms of there's obviously sponsorships. Is it ticketing for the events? There's it sounds like maybe wanting to charge the cities, right, to host the events. As you talk about like this business model and not kind of betting on linear television as the path forward, or the cash cow, so to speak, like what other pillars make up that business model as it evolves, and how do you think about, especially now talking about this metaverse piece, like taking advantage of that and capturing what is that audience who's in that participatory, like, they are cyclists, but they can't participate in the events, at least not right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're trying to do, which hasn't been done before, is kind of take the traditional ball sport model and apply it to, cycling into racing. So just like the NBA or NFL, we have tickets, although the vast majority of the folks who are spectators are free. We do have like a VIP area, we sell tickets, but we really want to make it open to the community. That's really important and core to our mission. We've also partnered with a variety of nonprofits that I'd love to share more about, but ticketing is a piece of it. Cities are excited to attract us, so they're willing to pay us. Merchandising is another big piece. There's a lot of cyclists. Believe it or not, cyclists spend $13 billion a year on cycling gear here in the US and 75 billion globally. So it's a
I
massive
believe it.
market.
It's
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
Yeah. One of those billion was you, right? Yeah. Getting ready for the triathlon. Then we have sponsorship, and then the media piece as well. We have a broadcast deal with Warner Brothers Discovery that is really a key piece of our strategy. And it sounds a little complicated, but that is literally what every other sports franchise outside of cycling. That's how they make their money. It's a pretty well-worn path, and so we're really taking advantage of that, which has been fantastic. It also means that we have diversified revenue streams. So when we're getting started, it's a lot more sponsorship and ticketing. But as we grow, there's going to be a lot more to do on the media rights side.
Yeah, definitely. The more people that are getting engaged, the more opportunity there is there. Coming back to what you've mentioned now in a couple different ways, the values, focusing on community, focusing on diversity, all of these things that are, you don't want to say buzzwords because they are so important and so impactful, and obviously meaningful in terms of where you're going, NCL, but also in broader society. But when I think different brands, right, or companies talk about them, you can kind of feel that it's inauthentic. Doing some research prior to this conversation and also hearing you talk about it now, it's very clear that it is the opposite of that. It is very authentic. It is key to, not only you personally, but the company. How have you been able to approach it that way, but also instill that kind of in the company as you're building?
Yeah. So one, just to kind of lay the groundwork, right? In US professional sports, they are 80% black and brown players. Zero of the owners of the NFL or NBA, majority owners are black or brown. So there is a massive disparity there. And, there have been generations of black and brown boys and all girls who have grown up and say, I want to be a professional athlete, but they never saw anyone that looked like them that's been an owner. And so that's a big piece of what motivates us. And again, it's too late for these other leagues to fix it. And what does it look like? I mean, honestly, it's a tax, right? It's a tax to do the right thing because there's a lot fewer funding sources that you can go to if you want to be majority, minority, and female owned, right? Our cap table, we have, over 100 people who have invested in the company. And that's not because we couldn't get bigger checks, but because if we want to own it and we want to run it, we have to do it that way, because there's not a lot of people in our community that can write a seven figure check. So that's a big piece of it. We're also very inclusive and want to make sure that people know that we're for everyone, right? It's a rainbow coalition, but it's also kind of to make a point there. Same thing on gender equity. I always say, what would happen if the WNBA played the first half and the NBA played the second half? Do you know what you call that sport? Basketball. But instead, because that's not the way it was created, there's this distinction, and I think it's going to be very, very hard for any women's league and who's entered in the last 10 to 20 years that's up against a league that's had 100 years and $100 billion in marketing to win out. And as long as you're comparing, it's very, very hard to catch up. That's why we're really trying to get this stuff ready from day one. But also, right, if you believe in gender equity as a company and you want to back a sports league, which one are you going to pick? Which one can you pick? Right? If you believe in sustainability, right, there's certain leagues that you absolutely, in certain sports, you absolutely cannot get behind. If diversity is one of your core values, right? Like, what does it say about you if you're investing in a league with zero minority owners and you're saying diversity is one of your core values? So I think it's good business. It's hard when you get started to literally cut off like some of your funding and to think about it that way. And there's some people that just aren't a good fit for us, and it's very obvious pretty early for them, and it's very obvious pretty early for us. But I think in the long term, this is what the next generation of consumers is looking for. This is how they're going to make their decisions. And it's going to be impossible for people to pivot into this if they didn't start from day one, and if it's just words and not actions.
I think that piece of it is very important because there are obviously hurdles, right? And sacrifices to some extent that you had to make to go down this path. And it's also challenging to then come out and say, which also you see this where folks come out and almost use it as marketing tactic, right? That we are diverse and gender equality and all these different things, where kind of your approach is like, no, this is just ingrained in what we're doing from the jump. So there's no question as to, hey, how do we cater to this or make sure we're thinking of that? It's like we've always done it this way, which, yeah, to your point, like you can't back into that now. So thinking and basically making that bet, not only is it the right thing to do, right, but also for the way in which consumers, businesses, athletes think about this going forward, it's kind of inevitable that it's only going to be this way.
And that like it's the way the world is moving, and there's going to be folks that see it and move there, and the world's going to catch up with them. And then there's going to be folks that are recalcitrant and don't do the right thing. And again, unfortunately, we see this unfold monthly in sports leagues around the world. And I just go back to this, the Women's World Cup and what happened on that stage. And it's just like, as soon as that happens, absolutely unacceptable. Everyone involved in it should have been fired. But no, what happened? Oh no, it wasn't, all this back and forth and everything else, right? And that shows that's values, right? Like that ultimately is the value of an organization, is when something like that happens, to think that there's some explaining to do or to think that there is some misunderstanding shows that the values are just not where they need to be, especially in women's soccer, and then you start moving up the chain. You're like, wait, there's no women in leadership in Spanish soccer. The commission, like boom, 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 boom. And then you start understanding why these things happen and why it's going to be so hard to change the culture and actually get there. Right. And like, the younger generation doesn't mess around with this stuff. Like cancel culture that all the older people hate. No, it's just called living by your values and doing the right thing. Because if you say one thing and do something else, if you are not aligned with the messaging that you're doing, you're getting canceled and you should be. And that's, I think, what you see. And that's why there's these flare ups, is just because it's not genuine. And again, like if you want to know what people's values are, look at who they hire, right? Look at how they conduct business. It's very clear. But now I think there's a shift of just the platitudes and people talking about it to people actually measuring it, whether it be the consumer or the investor. or the media are measuring it and saying, is this real or is this not? Right. I think everyone realizes that clean coal, right, is not the future we need. And just putting clean in front of it isn't it. And I think there's a lot of those things that are now starting to unravel pretty quickly.
Yeah, the kind of logical down this path you think about, and definitely in my experience, when you mentioned the nonprofit work that you're doing, I think of it as like who is participating in cycling. It's certainly not a whole lot of black and brown folks who are at the cycling event or a cycling club, unfortunately. And when you think about increasing access, who is the fan of this league? How do you go about kind of shifting that relative to like who traditionally has been a cyclist?
Yeah, I mean, we have a multi-prong approach there, right? The first is the work that we do. This year, we partnered quite deeply with Wish for Wheels. They're a nonprofit out of Denver that builds bikes for Title One schools. So really, some of the neediest schools for second graders. So we do bike builds, and then we give the bikes and teach the kids how to ride. And our professional athletes, our team members, actually build it and teach the bikes how to. And I mean, it's good for them, it's good for the kids, and it's wonderful, but it is the absolute best for us, right? I mean, we built bikes with Feinberg Fisher School in Miami Beach, and the girl that I got partnered with, she picked out her bike, and she's shaking in excitement as I fit her helmet and we put her bike together. And I say, are you excited? And she's like, I'm so excited. I go, have you ever ridden a bike? Never. And within 2 minutes, she was up and riding this bike. And it was just this magical moment for me. So, one is how do you invest in and actually get kids on bikes who traditionally haven't done it? That being said, actually, a lot of kids do have access to bikes. It's helmets that they need. So, that's another piece. Secondly, I would say is giving people of color pathways to become professional cyclists, right? And again, like, that second grader, it's going to take a while for them to be riding in the NCL. But you think about that sprinter, who's at a historically black college university, saying, "Hey, have you ever thought about cycling? Let's get you on the thing." And that's a 1 to 2 year kind of plan. The last thing I would say is you're right in terms of a lot of these endurance events are not particularly popular with minority communities. That being said, minority groups are the fastest growing new riding group out there. And so it is a really big thing. And there's these massive groups like, major Taylor groups in every large city. And so cycling with black and brown people is actually really coming up. It's a lot of where they do their networking. It's a lot of other things because, I mean, you think about the traditional place where people do their networking, the golf course. Guess who hasn't been particularly welcomed at the golf course, right? And so cycling is taking this role, and I think the community is really taking it onto itself. And I really think there's a proliferation on it. And so when we're going, in Atlanta, it was the who's who of the Atlanta Black community that was there and supporting it because they got it. They get the ownership thing, and actually a lot of them bike. The other thing that I think is really fascinating, on the professional athlete side, we found it. Cycling is the number two sport for most professional athletes. They love it. It's on the DL, but every locker room you go into, there's some of the most competitive, basketball players, football players out there, go to Italy and ride their bikes to calm down, and stay in shape over the off season. So it's been really great to meet these folks. And once you see a 7-footer on a bike, just like dominating, you can't go back.
Yeah, I think it was maybe Jimmy Graham, who is I guess still in the NFL, is apparently like a huge cyclist, and there's a lot of guys, former NFLers, who get together and do long rides and races and things like that. So it's very cool to see. Um, Thinking about where you are now, building going forward, you mentioned having a bunch of athletes and kind of diversity on the cap table. Are you thinking about this as continuing to raise funding, approaching it as a traditional venture backed company? How do you think about financing and growth and just what it looks like, either metric wise or benchmark wise on that side, to like hit those milestones to continue down that path?
Yeah, I mean, we had three KPIs, big KPIs this year that we wanted to do with the money we raised. One, we wanted to show we could do it. which a lot of people didn't think so. But in 1 year, we're the largest race organizer and the largest team owner in the U.S. Two, we wanted to show that people would show up. We had tens of thousands of people at our in-person events, tens of thousands of people watching. Amazing social media pickup. So we really feel like we have something that people want. And then the last one was to show that our revenue model worked, and we got revenue in each of those buckets that we talked about earlier. So I think we really proved it out. We have a really, I think, bold and exciting plan for 2024. We're expanding the number of teams we have to Atlanta. We're doubling down on our event partners in those locations, and really expanding kind of on all fronts. And we're currently getting a lot of inbounds for investment based on the success that we've had, but we're really thinking about, what does the funding look like for 24 and 25. It's going to be a mix of equity and revenue. As we go into those, less and less equity and more revenue as we continue to grow. And that's something, again, that goes back to our mission, which is, if we need to raise $100 million for this, it's going to be very hard to keep it majority minority and female owned. And so we're being really thoughtful about how we grow, and just like software, build, measure, learn, do MVPs, try a lot of different things, and be very honest with ourselves once we figured something out, and once there's still a way to go, and quickly change direction there and change tack. Because the way that we grow cycling in America, the way that we really get more people involved, is by having a successful, sustainable business, which, in the US, no one has figured out how to do that in cycling. And we want to be the team that's able to do that.
Yeah, as we get through, you mentioned in terms of expansion, how you're thinking about it and making sure that you're doing that growth in a sustainable way. For folks who are listening, you think about whether it's through the back half of the year or early next year. Is there anything that you would kind of say, hey, be on the lookout for, that you're especially excited about, that folks should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, absolutely. We're working on re-signing our broadcast deal, which we're excited about. So we're going to be live streaming the races. Come to the race; it is an incredible experience. It's great to watch the broadcast, but when you see 50 riders inches apart from each other going 30 miles an hour, like, your heart just is pounding. There's no way around it. So that's really, I think, a fantastic part. We'd love to have everyone along on the journey. So follow us at NCL Racing on Instagram, at Miami Knights, at Denver Disruptors, our two teams. And we're going to be announcing some pretty exciting things about the team in Atlanta. It's going to be the first team that we try out team ownership with. We're a single entity model, and so the league owns all the teams, but we're thinking about, what that looks like. We've had, about a dozen people who you would recognize their names who have come forward and say, hey, how do I own the Atlanta team? So we're thinking about what that looks like, and it's going to be really interesting and really fun. But, we really try to catalog it across LinkedIn and on the business side, and Instagram on the team side. So we'd love people to follow us along on that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll make sure that everything is kind of linked up when the show notes, when it goes live, and really excited to see how things continue and unfold. So thanks for making some time to join us today.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Great conversation.
One more thing before you head out: help us spread the word. Take a minute to rate and review the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel, or share this episode with a friend. And if you like conversations like this, you'll love the Fit Insider newsletter. We send it every Tuesday. The link is in the description. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you back here next week.